Everyone, and welcome to the virtual lecture at the brink of nuclear war, U.S. policy decisions during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis by Dr. Felix Martin. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University in Miami, which organized today's event. Before proceeding, let me remind you that you can submit questions during and after the lecture in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll compile these questions and pose them to our speaker after his presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Felix Martin. Felix is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University, and is also a member of the affiliate faculty of the Cuban Research Institute at FIU. Previously, he taught at Hunter College, Rutgers University, and St. Peter's College. He holds an MPhil and PhD degree in political science from Columbia University, and also holds an MA in political science from the University of Chicago. He earned his BA in economics and political science from St. Peter's College. He spent the 2000-2001 academic year in Madrid, Spain, at the Universidad de Alcalá de Henares as a senior lecturer and researcher with a Fulbright Fellowship. He's also received the John and Catherine MacArthur Fellowship and a Dorothy Danforth Compton Fellowship in World Affairs. His areas of expertise include international relations theory, security and peace studies, and international political economy. He is a specialist in the security and political economy of Latin America and Southern Europe. His research interests include the theories of international relations, strategic culture, peace studies, management of international life, the political economy of healthcare services on a global scale, and the management and resolution of the tragedy of the commons. Dr. Martin has published 3 books so far. The first one, which was single-authored, titled Military Peace in South America, Conditions for War and Peace, published in 2006. A second one, which was co-authored, titled Russia and Latin America, From Nation State to Society of States, published in 2013. And Latin America's Quest for Globalization, the Role of Spanish Firms, credited in 2005. His academic articles have been published in several professional journals, including Revista Quorum in Spain, Revista Española de Estudios Norteamericanos, Foro Internacional in Mexico, Económica in France, the Delaware Review of Latin American Studies, Peace Research Journal, Canadian Journal of Peace Studies, and the Whitehead Journal of Diplomacy and International Relations. He's also published several book chapters on international relations, national security, and foreign investment in South America, particularly in Argentina and Chile, as well as the Hispanic Caribbean. So without further ado, I give you my colleague, Dr. Felix Martin.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Amy, for the wonderful introduction, probably undeservedly, but I am pleased to be here and meet the audience. Just to, as a way of introduction, I would like to point out that this presentation is based on an article, co-author article with Dr. Jan Yu Kim, who teaches at the National University of Seoul, or Seoul National University, I should say. And he was one of my former doctoral students. If anyone is interested in the more complex article, I'll be happy to send you a copy, a link to the journal, and you'll be able to read it. So thank you for that. Now, just as a way of overview, and thank you for coming out and listening to my presentation. I'd like to point out that my presentation will touch on 5 different points. First of all, I will introduce the topic in the introduction. Second, I will follow with some discussion of the research questions and the relevance of this research. Third, I will talk about the main feature, which is the case study, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fourth, then I enter into sort of a methodological discussion by way of disaggregating the single case study into individual decision makers. And then we touch on the 4 presidential executive committee meetings that we have the recordings and talk about the conclusion. So without further ado, it is important to remind the audience that talking about nuclear weapons 15, 20 years ago was not a big deal anymore because people grew accustomed to the fact that perhaps nuclear weapons were not ever going to be mentioned or discussed or as a policy option. As recently as the last 6-7 months, we have heard President Putin talk about the possibility of using a tactical nuclear device. So suddenly, people have begun to talk about nuclear weapons and retaliation and how to deter the use of nuclear weapons. So let me just begin by talking about this and understanding some of the aspects about how to deter the use of nuclear weapons. And obviously, the Cuban case study is a primer for that. We should begin by reminding the audience that the Cold War generated multiple political and military showdowns between the Americans and the Soviets. They contended, as you may recall, for geostrategic superiority and political influence in Greece, Germany, Korea, Hungary, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, and Afghanistan. All these crises heightened the intensity of their systemic rivalry to unprecedented levels. However, none was as extreme, frightening, or threatening to humanity as the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This crisis was unique because it brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Besides U.S. General MacArthur's 1951 proposal to President Harry Truman to bomb China and resort to atomic weapons in the Korean War in 1953, and a suggestion immediately rejected by the president, the specter of a nuclear war was never as real until then, nor has it been since. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis is important case that brought pause to the superpower rivalry, and it probably saved the world from complete annihilation. Notwithstanding this positive outcome, world citizens still live in an international state system where several countries possess sufficient nuclear power to cause a cataclysmic disaster, as I mentioned at the outset, especially in the case of Ukraine recently. Given the current references to a new Cold War between China and the United States, the uncertainty of the first nuclear multipolar system in history, the Ukrainian war against a nuclear power, Russia, and tensions in the Sino-Indian and Indo-Pakistani borders, it is instructive to investigate how American decision makers reacted to Moscow's attempt to revise the status quo in October 1962, and how their group thinking evolved over 2 weeks, to be precise, 13 days, prompting the reformulation of a firm new policy against the Soviet infringement in Cuba. Our study focuses on this theme, seeking to discuss the implication of the crisis for nuclear deterrence literature. Rational deterrence is a central theoretical notion in the study of war and peace in international relations. Its prominence increased exponentially with the invention and proliferation of nuclear weapons, which raised the specter of a potential US-Soviet nuclear showdown during the Cold War. The urgency to understand and prevent a nuclear war produced an instant and keen interest among academics, policy circles, and the general public about deterrence theory and practice. Subsequently, the 4 waves of deterrence theory significantly advanced the understanding of the conditions necessary for a successful operation of deterrence threat, such as short-term military balance, costly signaling, domestic audiences, and reputation for result, which would purportedly dissuade a revisionist state from initiating an attack. Nuclear weapons have been treated as a special instrument of deterrence with their unprecedented capability to inflict unacceptable damage. Accordingly, the traditional deterrence literature, especially the nuclear revolutionist, regards nuclear weapons as the ultimate means to buttress a deterrent policy. However, various studies in the nuclear pessimist tradition show that nuclear punishment or retaliation is infeasible in most cases due to the opponent's second strike capabilities, tactical redundancy, and the logic of self-deterrence. In this vein, if the challenger's defiance against nuclear deterrence is expected to go unpunished by the defender, then the deterrent policy is not credible and thus will likely fail, as it happened in Cuba in 1962. As we know well, the United States had a very clear deterrent policy against, implanting nuclear weapons in the Western Hemisphere. The fact that Nikita Khrushchev placed nuclear weapons in Cuba is tantamount to nuclear deterrence failure. So consequently, the following questions about the possible aftermath of deterrence failure are pertinent. Can the defender violently punish the challenger possessing nuclear weapons? That is, can the United States violently punish the challenger, in this case, the former Soviet Union, in this case? If it can, under what conditions? These were the questions that motivated our original study, but today I will avoid discussing the complexities of the theory of deterrence and its addendum compellence, which means do not attack because I will retaliate and punish you. Compellence, on the other hand, means please return to the previous status quo or the status quo ante or face massive retaliation and punishment. Our study answers these two questions by tracing who suggested which policy during the American deliberation process of the Cuban Missile Crisis. First, teasing out the theoretical implications of deterrence theory, it derives a testable hypothesis and its compelling counterparts from the literature. Second, our study uses the Cuban Missile Crisis as a litmus test for the analysis, given the presumable failure of the American deterrence threat in October 1962. The article focused only on the American side of the decision-making process during the crisis. Accordingly, the study examines the evolution of the thinking process of key members of the executive committee from the beginning of the crisis to its decision to quarantine Cuba on October 20th, 1962. In closing, we present the conclusions of the analysis as well as the associated theoretical and policy implications. I will obviate here the long and tedious theoretical analysis of deterrence, as I mentioned earlier, and compellence, and will jump directly into the summary of the key meetings of the President's Executive Committee. The case study of Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a remarkably rare case in which humanity may have been on the brink of a nuclear holocaust and the possibility of mass extinction. Thus, this case provides researchers with exceptional laboratory tests for various hypotheses on crisis escalation and de-escalation, as well as deterrence and compellence involving nuclear threats. President John F. Kennedy contributed to the elevation of this crisis' academic significance even further by recording almost all the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ESCOM, meetings that took place during the portentous 13 days. The availability of the Kennedy tapes allows us scholars, including my colleague, Dr. Kim, and myself, to open the black box and analyze the decision-making process of the crisis actors at the critical juncture. This study tests the set of research and competing hypotheses proposed in the previous actions against the American policymaking dynamic during the crisis. The study investigates the classified primary sources, the Kennedy tapes, and the memoirs of the political elites in Moscow and Washington. As I said above, the problem with this case is that it's a single case study with limited number of observations. This is a methodological inconvenience recognized at the outset of the study in order to work around it and use the case effectively. Of course, it is recognized that to test the impact of the independent variables on the dependent variable, it is difficult. In an ideal methodological condition, this would allow the study to engage in a control comparison. The unavailability of multiple observations makes the single case study approach a weak design of the research. The study generates multiple observations within a single case study by disaggregating the data to address this shortcoming. Consequently, the study develops more observable implications of the theory expounded above by running process tracing on key individual decision makers who integrated the various political elites within the ESCOM over different phases of the 13-day crisis. Accordingly, every single individual who participated in each ESCOM meeting constitutes an empirical observation. By treating the data as such, this article aims to conduct a most similar system comparison, analyzing the same actors at different intervals throughout the tense crisis. This research traces the deliberation process throughout the ESCOM meetings from the point when Washington discovered the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba on October 15th and convened the first ESCOM meeting the next day to the moment when Kennedy decided to take the naval blockade option on October 20th. The analysis compares divergent perspectives within the ESCOM. It attempts to demonstrate how different individuals' perspective about the USSR's feasibility of nuclear retaliation and divergent types of belief updating led policymakers in Washington to decide on different countermeasures against the Soviet challenge to the United States deterrent threat. Specifically, the focus of the analysis is on the following 5 individuals as separate within cases in this study as they present the final 2 approaches, airstrike versus blockade, that emerged at the National Security Council meeting on October 20th, 1962. First, George Bundy, a special assistant to the president for national security affairs. Second, General Maxwell Taylor. Third, Chair Dean Rusk, Secretary of State. Fourth, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense. And fifth, President John F. Kennedy. The following analysis is based on the transcripts of tape recordings of the ESCOM meetings and the minutes of the 505th National Security Committee meeting. Before we do that, we need to establish what were the basis for United States policy of deterrence against the Soviet Union up until 1962. We established whether the U.S. made a clear deterrent threat before the October 1962 crisis. Starting in August 1962, a series of reports arrived in Washington about a significant increase in the number of commercial ships sailing towards Cuba. CIA Director John McCone believed that the astonishing boost of Soviet shipment to Cuba might be a harbinger of this worst case or nightmare, turning the island less than 100 miles away from the United States into a Soviet missile base. He feared that Khrushchev would always be tempted to deploy medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba to even the scale of nuclear violence significantly favoring the United States. McCone first raised these possibilities during the special group meeting on August 10, 1962, and called for the use of the U.S. military force only to be rejected by the majority of the security advisors. The U-2 flight over Cuba on August 29th found that 8 surface-to-air missiles, SAM missile sites, were only 1 or 2 weeks from completion, and that there had been a significant increase in defense capabilities compared to what the previous reconnaissance flight found on August 5th. However, instead of following McCone's proposal, Kennedy decided to give a fair warning to Khrushchev. So on September 4th, the White House Press Secretary Pierre Salinger read the presidential statement that the United States was aware of Soviet technicians and USSR weapons such as anti-aircraft defense missiles and motor torpedo boats in Cuba. Washington confirmed that they had not found, quote unquote, any organized combat force in Cuba from any Soviet bloc country, of military bases provided to Russia, or a violation of the 1934 treaty relating to Guantanamo, of the presence of offensive ground-to-ground missiles or other significant offensive capability, end quote. However, the statement added, quote, we are worried to be otherwise, the gravest issues would arise. Kennedy reiterated this warning on September 13, 1962. During the presidential news conference, he stated, quote, if at any time the communist buildup in Cuba were to endanger or interfere with our security in any way, including our base at Guantanamo, our passage to the Panama Canal, our missile and space activities at Cape Canaveral, or the lives of American citizens in this country, or if Cuba should ever attempt to export its aggressive purpose by force or the threat of force against any nation in this hemisphere or become an offensive military base of significant capability for the Soviet Union, then this country, meaning the United States, will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies. The Kennedy administration's warning on September 4th and 13th confirmed that the missile crisis was a case of deterrence failure because the Soviet Union did not heed the warning from President Kennedy. Yet it could also be labeled as a compelling failure because before Kennedy made those threats, Khrushchev had already ordered the implementation of Operation Anadir and done things describing Kennedy's list of don't-dos. These actions included authorizing deployment of 2 R-14 IRBMs regiments, 3 R-12 MRBMs regiments, that's middle-range ballistic missiles, 33 Ilyushin-28 bombers, 33 MiG-4 helicopters, 40 MiG-21s, and 4 motorized rifle regiments. The first ship carrying SAMs and supporting apparatus for the middle-range ballistic missiles left the Soviet port at the end of July, and the first shipment, the Maria Iluana, arrived in Cuba on July 26. In this regard, Kennedy's threat in September 1962 can be identified as compelling threat in the eyes of Moscow because the policy of deterrence was enunciated post this decision on the part of Khrushchev. However, the main element of Soviet forces that Kennedy was most worried about had not arrived in Cuba when he made his September threats. The first Soviet MRBMs, middle-range ballistic missiles, arrived on September 15th. It was 2 days after the announcement of Kennedy's second threat and 11 days after his first warning. This fact, thus, still makes the crisis a general deterrence failure. Besides, Washington was not aware of Khrushchev's decision in June and responded to the crisis as if U.S. general deterrent threat had failed. Therefore, after detecting the failure, the deliberation should be treated as an example of the strategic thinking process after general deterrence failure because the defendant, the U.S., believed that it was such. Now, jumping on to the meetings, we need to keep in mind that there were 4 meetings. And I will try to just give you the analysis, the setting of each of these meetings and the conclusion in order to be within the 30-minute mark. The first ExComm meeting started with the report by CIA Assistant Director of Photographic Interpretation Arthur Lundahl and Chief of the Missile and Space Division Sidney Greyholt. They summarized that the CIA had found from photos taken during the October 14 U-2 flight over Cuba, 1 middle-range ballistic missile launch site and 2 newly established military encampments in west central Cuba. However, many uncertainties put the committee in a challenging position in devising countermeasures. For example, Washington did not know first how many other missile sites might have been under construction on different parts of the island. 2, when these other missiles would be operational. 3, whether the missiles had nuclear warheads, or if not, where they were stored. And critically, fourth, what the intention of the Soviets was. In other words, what it seemed clear that Khrushchev blatantly challenged Kennedy's defensive deterrent posture. The exact degree and depth of the violation was uncertain. So at that point, Secretary Rusk was the first advisor to suggest possible countermeasures. First, he defined the missile deployment in Cuba as a very serious development, which the U.S. should eliminate. Secretary Rusk then proposed two general courses of action. First, a surprise attack, but not necessarily an invasion of Cuba. Two, a combination of non-violent measures that could make Moscow give up the missile bases, although he was open to both paths, rapid and gradual escalation. Rusk preferred the second option. For him, the U.S. was facing a situation that could well lead to general war, and it would be essential to give everybody a chance to pull away from this scenario as soon as possible. In response, Secretary McNamara tried to set a principle that any type of airstrike would only be feasible if those Soviet missiles in Cuba were not operational. So if I continue with every one of these individuals, it would be a very lengthy presentation. So I would just give you the snippet of each of the main actors in the first meeting. Then, of course, General Taylor agreed with McNamara on the need to take out all the missiles once the U.S. Air Force went into Cuba. However, he was pessimistic about the possibility of knowing the exact timing of when those missiles would be operational. A Special Assistant Bundy's position was not clearly defined in this first meeting. He pointed out the surgical strike should not be ruled out because of the substantial political advantage in limiting the strike. However, Special Assistant Bundy also demonstrated his interest in non-violent track towards the resolution. In sum, although all ExCom members were open to some type of military response, except for Taylor, the rest were cautious about going directly to a military punishment such as an airstrike, either surgical or extensive on an invasion. The second ExCom meeting on October 16 happened between 6:30 p.m. and 7:55 p.m. when the ExCom meeting convened at 6:30. Again, on the same day, General Marshall Carter, Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, brought additional information to the committee based on further readouts of photographic evidence reported in the morning. First, there might be 16 to 24 missiles in Cuba. Second, these missiles were likely the solid propellant type with an inertial guidance system, which would take about 2 weeks to be ready, yet could be fired on short notice once they became operational. Third, these missiles were highly vulnerable even to ordinary rifle fire. Fourth, the reconnaissance flight did not find any evidence of nuclear warheads storage. Fifth, they verified again that those missiles were middle-range ballistic missiles that matched the information provided by the Iron Barrack. These reports revealed that the USSR flagrantly challenged the United States deterrent threat, but that American conventional weapons could quickly take out those Soviet missile facilities. Then we move on to the third meeting, but before, let me sum up the second meeting. Almost every participant in the second meeting, except for President Kennedy, learned or leaned towards the rapid escalation path. This increase of aggressiveness in the American policy choice was because it turned out that while the level of Soviet challenges, 16 to 24 middle-range ballistic missiles on the construction was severe, it seemed entirely feasible for the United States to take out those missiles. They were not operational yet and very vulnerable. In the In the in the third executive meeting on October 18th at 11 a.m. to 1:15 p.m. on October 17th, President Kennedy resumed his regular schedule to avoid possible suspicions by Moscow. He met the West German foreign minister and attended a luncheon for the Libyan crown prince and flew to Connecticut to support the campaign of a Democratic candidate running for the U.S. Senate. Meanwhile, his staff continued to meet and discuss possible countermeasures against the Soviet challenge. CIA Director John McCone returned from his stepson's funeral and joined the team. The Joint Chief of Staff came up with 5 different groups of targets with required numbers of sorties. First, target number 1, missiles and nuclear storage, 52 sorties. 2, target number 2, target 1 plus all Ilyushin 28 and MiG-21, 104 sorties. Target 3, target 2 plus other aircrafts, the surface-to-air missile sites, cruise missiles, and missile boats, 194 sorties. 4, target number 4, all military targets except for tanks, 474 sorties. And 5, target 5, all military targets, 2,002 sorties. Key agendas for the ExCom meeting on October 17 were: first, which type of military action Washington should take, and second, whether political measures were to proceed before the attack. Kennedy returned from his campaign trip on Wednesday night and decided to stay out of the discussion until the next day. The meeting went on until midnight. The next morning, McCone informed the president of new findings from complete readouts of images taken by U-2 flights over Cuba on October 14 and 15, as well as from additional photographs taken on October 17. First, the reconnaissance mission discovered 2 more missile sites to the southwest of Havana that show the pattern of middle range and intermediate range ballistic missiles launch complex. Second, the 3 missile bases discovered earlier seemed to have expedited the development. 16 to 24 missiles were now to be operational within a week. Third, 2 more cruise missiles sites were found at Santa Cruz del Norte. Fourth, the photo images revealed an airfield for Il-28 bombers at San Julian. These intelligence updates revealed that the situation was much more dangerous than the executive committee members had first thought, especially because the intermediate range ballistic missiles that placed 90% of the American population in jeopardy. It turned out that the Soviets had made an extremely dangerous move, and most ExCom members, including Rusk, McNamara, Taylor, and Kennedy, ruled out the non-action option. Rusk warned that backing down from the clear warning of the head of a state would inevitably free the Soviet hands for almost any kind of intervention, possibly in Berlin and Korea. He also feared that a non-action should undermine and undercut the long support from the public that we need. He recommended that Washington take massive military action while the legal basis of the Rio Pact or by the declaration of war on Cuba. Rusk emphasized that a surgical strike would involve the greatest risk because it was to aim at destroying a too high number of targets. Nevertheless, he continued to share a more prudent voice in his department, especially by destroying too many numbers of targets. Nevertheless, he continued to share a more prudent voice in his department, especially the note of Charles Bolin, former ambassador to the Soviet Union, who asserted the necessity of taking diplomatic action before turning to any military action. Then there was reaction for all the members, but McNamara sided with Rusk and underscored the need to remove any limited strike options. Taylor also agreed with Rusk and McNamara on the necessity of an extensive strike. However, he disagreed on the impact of warning before the attack. And President Kennedy agreed that the U.S. should take some measures to punish Khrushchev for his flagrant challenge against American deterrent threats. Still, those actions should be conducive to lessening the challenge of the nuclear exchange and maintaining some degree of solidarity with our allies. Based on this discussion, McNamara outlined the two courses of action that Washington could take. One, a slow introduction of military action, the so-called gradual escalation that included a political statement and blockade. Two, the rapid introduction of military action of rapid escalation, a brief warning to Khrushchev followed by a forceful military attack. Except for Taylor, all the ex-com members believed that Washington should notify Moscow in some way before the U.S. military operation against the Soviet bases in Cuba. Before they closed the meeting, Theodore Sorensen, Kennedy's speechwriter, summarized the discussion by saying that there was a general, though not unanimous agreement that some kind of representation to Khrushchev ahead of time was necessary. The fourth executive committee meeting on October 20th started at 2:30 Washington time. This time, CIA Deputy Director Ray Klein updated the Council on Military Development in Cuba. He reported that among those four to five middle-range ballistic missile sites, two of them were believed to be in the state of limited operational readiness. Also, the reconnaissance mission found two fixed intermediate ballistic missile sites under construction. One was estimated to be operational within 6 weeks, while the other would be between December 15 and December 31st. Although the U-2 flight did not find the nuclear warheads storage, the intelligence team supposed to presuppose that these warheads should be nearby, given that the middle range and intermediate range ballistic missiles would be ineffective without them. The report concluded that the estimation that around 8 middle range were fully operational and ready to be fired. The two courses of action that McNamara summarized in the previous ExCom meeting, the third meeting, were developed into a presidential message and a well-formulated scenario report. Because the intelligence report suggested that some of those Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba were operational, McNamara switched his position from rapid escalation to blockade route or gradual escalation. Rusk, McNamara, Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and Sorensen supported this path. Bundy, on the other hand, converted from gradual escalation to airstrike alternative, that is, rapid escalation, and he believed that a decisive action might lead to a fait accompli that would be difficult to be reversed by the Soviet. Taylor, Douglas Dillon, Secretary of the Treasury, and McCone endorsed this course of action. Unfortunately, as the ExCom members convened in the Oval Office, we do not have the tape recording transcripts for this meeting. Instead, we have the minutes from the National Security Council meeting that are, quote, exceptionally detailed and included two-turn exchanges. For example, argument and counter-argument, questions and answers. However, they still lack the intensity of exchanges between the clashing approaches. This section, thus, briefly discusses the main argument of the two competing perspectives. First, the blockade route was defined as a series of attempts to prevent additional transfer of Soviet missiles to Cuba and to remove the already deployed offensive assets through negotiation. For example, trading American missiles in Turkey or Italy with the Soviet ones in Cuba, limiting American use of Guantanamo. If Moscow responded with too risky demands, the blockade could be followed by an ultimatum to remove the missiles backed by punishment of airstrike. McNamara knew it might take a long time to take out those missiles and that it would damage the U.S. reputation, which would have some repercussions for domestic politics and alliance relations. This gradual escalation path, he believed, had at least 4 advantages. 1, causing less trouble to allies. 2, avoiding a surprise attack that would betray the American tradition. 3, taking only possible military action that fit the leader of the free world. And 4th, preventing escalation to a general war. The airstrike alternative was a path to destroy all the missiles and the jet bombers simultaneously. Those who supported this course of action had the following rationale. First, the very existence of those missiles could not be accepted, and the longer they remain stationed there, the riskier the situation would be for Washington. Second, this was the last chance for Washington to remove USSR offensive capabilities in Cuba, because it would become impossible to locate them once the Soviets completed camouflaging the weapons. Third, even though some nuclear missiles might survive after receiving the extensive American airstrike, Moscow would not retaliate against Washington with the second strike capability. So on average, this is sort of the rendition of the different scenarios there. And of course, we have to come to the conclusion of this presentation, because time is of the essence at this point. 3 scenarios are important to highlight. First of all, the final policy decided by the ExCom was not general escalation, but hedging. That is, the combination of non-violent use of military force and political assurance. The Soviet nuclear capability on the island did not have some crystal ball effect and constrain the U.S. from deciding on the massive airstrike or invasion route. Nevertheless, the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons failed to prevent Washington from adjusting the degree of violence below the use of military force level. Although the blockade was a milder punishment compared to the extensive airstrike, it did involve the use of substantial military power that could trigger a major armed conflict, possibly a nuclear war. The second scenario was the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles failed to deter ExCom advisors from advocating the strike option. On the contrary, most advisors asserted the necessity of forcibly moving those Soviet assets as soon as U-2 flights detected the IL-28 jet bombers. The third position, more interesting for Bundy and Taylor, even the possibility of the existence of the Soviet second strike capability did not prevent them from advocating the rapid escalation route and urging extensive airstrikes of all the Soviet bases in Cuba. It is fascinating to see that the introduction of nuclear weapons had no impact at all on some of the policymakers in Washington. These individuals believed that a blockade would only prevent further deployment of Soviet offensive assets to Cuba and could not do anything about the missile that had already been deployed. The U.S. had only two options: either trade out the missiles or go in and get them ourselves. For those who did not like the idea of trading missiles, the forceful removal was the only option left, despite the enormous risk it carried. In closing, the 3 points discussed above reject the rival hypothesis. Why were some ExCom members recommending the rapid escalation path of wiping out the entire Soviet bases on the island, despite the mutual assuring destruction of strategic conditions and the possibility of war. As posited in this study, research hypothesis feasible model that Washington would not believe that the U.S. attempts to remove the Soviet bases in Cuba forcibly would result in nuclear war under two conditions. These conditions included, first, if Soviet nuclear retaliation were not militarily feasible, and second, as long as the Americans religiously turned to conventional forces. This explanation survives the smoking gun test. The discrepancies among policymakers in Washington precisely stem from their different estimation about the feasibility of the Soviet nuclear retaliation against a conventional American strike. The ex-com advisors recommended that the Kennedy make either an announced or a surprise airstrike on the Soviet missile site in Cuba only when they believed that Moscow would most likely not use their nuclear missiles to retaliate against the United States. And this, moving on, we have to reach a conclusion. Although the general trend of change in Washington's policy debate in the aftermath of deterrence failure follows the nuclear revolutionist prediction that I discussed in detail in my study, the model fails to explain individuals' advisors' specific positions at each information set. First, most ex-com members advocated the rapid escalation path until the intelligence team confirmed that some Soviet nuclear missiles had been operational. Second, even after this confirmation, Taylor and Bundy urged Washington to take a rapid escalation path. Third, the final policy decision of Washington was hedging rather than gradual escalation. This mitigated impact of the crystal ball effect implies that threats backed by nuclear weapons are not credible until the crisis actor successfully makes the use of these weapons a feasible tool of punishment. The executive committee advisors did not think twice about the infeasibility of the threat as Khrushchev had expected until they realized, number one, there might be some surviving nuclear missiles ready to be launched after receiving the extensive US strike on the Soviet base. Two, the control of atomic warheads might not lie in the hands of politicians in Moscow, but in those of the local commanders. Three, the considerable size of Soviet ground forces in Cuba would significantly increase the number of Soviet casualties when the US force struck the island. The Soviet nuclear weapons finally began to affect American strategic thinking once these three conditions were met on October 20, 1962. And to wrap it up, we need to keep in mind that the aftermath of this very detailed discussion, which I hope can be looked at in the actual article, is that the public did not know, and most of the allies did not know, but ultimately the United States that was about to remove the Minuteman missiles from Turkey, exchanged and gave Nikita Khrushchev a face-saving solution and stay out of the nuclear weapons scenario. As you may recall, this understanding between Khrushchev, the Nikita Khrushchev understanding, left a Soviet combat brigade in Cuba, and of course, but it prevent the outbreak of a nuclear weapon. And perhaps if that would have happened, we would not be actually analyzing an event that took place some 61 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, especially for summarizing what I know is a very complex situation and a very interesting analysis of that complex situation. So let me remind the virtual audience, we have a few minutes for a Q&A, and that you can submit your questions on that button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. We already have a couple of them, but before turning to them, I wanted to ask you briefly, Dr. Martin, if you think that your case study of the missile crisis differs substantially from another previous crisis related to Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And I wanted specifically to refer to the concept of groupthink that I know was developed on the basis of that first crisis. Was there groupthink in this case, in your case study of the missile crisis, or was it a different kind of deliberation?
Well, first of all, I think that from the moment of that first crisis that you mentioned to the nuclear weapons, the group thinking approach was very influential in the decision-making process. Also, very important in that decision, and I listen intently to those tapes. It's impossible to replicate everything that we hear and the emotions and the tapes. Only historians have the patience to get through that, and I have to make an effort. But the group thinking was influential, and also was the role of President Kennedy in terms of not acting too emotional and jumping to conclusions that would exacerbate the dangerous situation that was going on between the former Soviet Union and the United States. I also sense, and this is only my sense, a little bit influenced by hindsight information, that Kennedy kind of understood that Nikita Khrushchev was in a bind. He needed to empathize a little bit and try to work out some sort of face-saving scenario for Nikita Khrushchev to sell to his public, to his generals, and to his cronies. Obviously, so that is why sometimes it was impossible to think that group thinking was not important. It is really very much part of this equation. And of course, the face-saving scenario that ultimately saved Nikita Khrushchev's position for a while, because it didn't last very much. After that, he was sacked out of the premiership in the former Soviet Union.
Thank you. So let's turn to a couple of questions that we have on the Q&A by Michael Amezaga. He wants to know, what do you think was Khrushchev's intention or in placing missiles in Cuba? To test the U.S. resolve or something else?
Well, I had as a way of an excuse, I had a situation where I wanted to contextualize not only this, but also the position of the former Soviet Union at the time, and also to contextualize the position of the Cuban government or regime, as some people refer to, at the time. Cuba needed protection, needed to find ways to somehow blackmail the Soviets to commit to them to Cuban more, but at the same time, the Soviets also felt that they were being left behind. They realized that the Americans had an advantage in terms of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons, and they had also weapons that in Turkey and Italy that would reach the Soviet Union airspace or territory very much. So I think that Nikita Khrushchev tried to place nuclear weapons there, not only as a challenge, but he thought that he could actually get away with murder, if you will. And placing them, it would put Washington under a position of distress, and probably under under more pressure from the Soviet Union to negotiate things, and to somehow use countervailing measures against American missiles in Turkey and Italy at the time.
Thank you. Now, another question by Michael Amezaga is, what was Fidel Castro's role in this entire event?
Well, Fidel Castro's role is, as we all know, I don't have firsthand information. I never study. There's no available tape recordings to define what Fidel Castro was thinking at the time. What we can do is extrapolate from his reactions in public. And obviously, his goal was, the Cubans, and the inner circle of the Cuban government felt highly insecure vis-a-vis the United States, and rightly so. because the United States had initiated a number of attempts to overthrow the Castro regime, and obviously they needed to find some type of help to find security. And what better way to woo the Soviets to protect them and to place offensive weapons in Cuban territory? So that had a double track there. And Castro was very upset when they removed those weapons there. If we can extrapolate from his after 1962 behavior, one can only say that he was upset and he was very insecure, and therefore he began the process of expanding the guerrilla force throughout Latin America. He went on to expand his activity in Africa and the Middle East and East Asia, because he wanted to somehow blackmail the Soviets and to come to them more forcibly. As you may recall, for those of you who have read that part, when the Soviets sent their tanks into Prague, into Czechoslovakia at the time, Castro was very, very slow in providing moral and political support for the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. So one can only extrapolate that he was using this as a bargaining chip. I'll give you some sort of political support in the third world at the time in exchange for greater degree of commitment to protect the Cuban government. So I can only extrapolate that. Obviously, the Soviets reacted because they have more power and said, fine, you don't want to give us support? We will ask our tankers to return or to circle in the middle of the Atlantic, and we'll see how long you can last without crude oil from the Soviet Union. That's the only thing that we can extrapolate from those scenarios.
Thank you. A question from Gene Rosenberg. Have you been able to examine any Soviet archives about the missile crisis?
No, I have not. I have not. Because our process was to understand the notion of, I am not a historian and a political scientist, I are a scholar, so what I do is, we wanted to test, the original purpose of this article, and this is the difficulty of presenting something like this, was to test the deterrence theory and deterrence failure in a nuclear scenario, okay? And really, the only case that we have of that is the case of the United States up until that point. And, right at the moment, we have heard Putin using the sort of veiled threats to use a tactical nuclear device in the Ukrainian war if they are approaching that, and this could be a game changer in terms of case studies. But I did not do. I am explaining why I did not examine the Soviet archives, because the purpose was to understand how the American decision makers saw the obvious deterrence failure, nuclear deterrence failure, and therefore we needed to understand how they were reacting to that, because the idea is not only reacting. Obviously, deterrence failure implies you go to war, but obviously you don't want to go to war using nuclear weapons. So the idea is, how do you come around and reestablish your deterrence without losing credibility in the eyes of your opponent, in this case, or challenger, in this case, the former Soviet Union. And that was very important to us to understand the group thinking going on in the inner circles of decision making in Washington.
Okay, and another question from Sebastian Arcos is in that direction. He wants to ask you if you can find parallels between the 1962 crisis and the current proxy war in Ukraine, where Putin has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons in retaliation to Western intervention.
Well, obviously, I mentioned that there is a parallel right there, because this is the second most important scenario over the last 6 decades, where the possibility of a nuclear device can be used to upset the balance of power between great powers. I don't call them superpowers anymore, because that was a Cold War terminology, but it is a great power, but a great power that is not so great anymore, other than having nuclear weapons. As we have seen, the weapons are not as effective as we thought that they were. So yes, there is a parallel in the case that he can turn around and use a nuclear device, and that is not going to be only affecting Western Europe, but it may affect the Russia territory as well. So here, what comes into question is to what extent isn't the self-deterrence position operating in the case of Russia? Yeah, and self-deterrence is, if we use a nuclear device, doesn't that affect us and affect our public? So that is the so-called self-deterrent. Maybe they are being cautious and probably avoiding to use it because they know they're going to suffer under from the fact of the effects of a nuclear deterrent. Obviously, another aspect that is playing into this is who knows what the position of the Chinese may be. Up to now, my reading was that the Chinese were actually telling Putin not to dare to use nuclear weapons, not to even go there, because this was going to upset the entire balance of power. And different from many other individuals, I think that the Chinese, while not the best friends of the United States or not the best friends of the international economic international liberal economic order, they benefit from it. And having a nuclear war going on in the world is quite upsetting to the well-being of China and the well-being of the Chinese people. So I think that up to now, I read the Chinese position of paying lip service to support Russia and Putin, but in reality they were about restraining Putin from going too far, or even to use a tactical nuclear weapon in the Ukrainian scenario. So these are two elements: self-deterrence on the part of the Russians, and then external pressure on the part of the Chinese. Will that change? We now hear that the Chinese are considering sending some weapons to Russia, because Russia is in dire need of more weapons. It's in dire need of ammunition, ordnance to actually continue fighting, and they are in dire need of capital to subsidize the war in Ukraine, and that probably is prompting the Chinese to say, "Fine, we'll give you some, but there are conditions attached to this." Okay, I don't think that China is about to give Putin all it wants, nor the Chinese are interested in destabilizing the international economic system, where they're going to suffer tremendously. In addition, let's not forget that most of the American public debt is in the hands of the Chinese, and the Americans are in a strong position here because a rupture in diplomatic relation and economic relation between China and the United States may jeopardize collecting that debt. Obviously, the United States would never do that, or would avoid doing that, because its credit rating will drop precipitously. And you don't want to get to that point and say, "Fine, you want to break relation, we're not paying you back."
Okay, here's another question from an anonymous attendee. I'm not sure what the question is about, but I'll read it to you. Any research about what the two Russian generals would have done if under attack by firing missiles?
What the Russian general, can you contextualize that, because I don't know what.
Yeah, I don't understand it either. So let's skip that one. We have two more questions, and I think we're gonna close with that from Carlos Armida. He asks, first, is there a possibility of having secret Russian weapons in Cuba now?
I doubt it. I really doubt it. Nowadays, with the imagery that the United States has at its disposal, I doubt it. They may not find a balloon flying, for several days, but they have that. I really doubt it. I mean, we are talking about nuclear, missile sites, etc. But other than that, it's impossible. Also, we have to remember that it doesn't make logistical military sense for Russia to have any type of weapons there. They just cannot maintain it. They can be wiped out, and then there is nothing they can do. They cannot replenish, etc. In the old days, the concern was about what about nuclear retaliation in other parts of the world, and during the Cold War, I think the former Soviet Union had better capability at the time, because if we know Russia is using today dated nuclear capability, from the Soviet era. They don't have anything newer or anything like that. In fact, they just sent a frigate to participate in a naval exercise with China and South Africa. And one thing that they said, although the Russian frigate is carrying these super hypersonic missiles, they say, no, we're not using those because, in other words, they're very careful about not using those weapons because they're very costly and they are in short supply. So I don't anticipate seeing any of that in Cuba, especially because of the surveillance capabilities of the United States, and because it doesn't make military logistical sense.
Okay. Our final question will be from Juan Fernandez, who wants to know if there was an invasion to topple the Cuban regime considered in the XCOM meetings.
Yes, well, an injection, it was not an invasion. What I heard was about massive airstrikes to take, in the XCOM meeting, there was never a discussion of let's conquer, let's invade Cuba and take control of Cuba. It was more about excising the danger to the American public, the American nation, and that was the nuclear weapons there and the bombers there, the strategic bombers there, the Ilyushin 28. So it was more, it was a general strike. One of the points that I made is this military plan was the maximum. The fifth option was about 2002 daily flight or sorties to take out weapons, and this is 2,000 a day. That's a lot of flying over Cuba, let alone invading Cuba and taking control of that. I don't think that the problem was there. I think that, in fact, I never heard of anyone suggesting an invasion. Naval blockade, yes, but an invasion, you don't. Again, that's another part that people talk about invading other countries. It doesn't make military sense. You can strangle an island nation by simply running an effective naval blockade. So that's the point. In fact, there is an anecdote that when the generals, the Joint Chief of Staff General, were discussing the possibility of a naval blockade against Cuba, McNamara started suggesting to tinkering a little bit. Well, let's do this, let's do that. So, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your position. However, you run the Department of Defense, but we run a blockade. We know how to. So So these are the things that a naval blockade would have been enough. It wasn't necessary. Remember, invading Cuba would have taken thousands of soldiers and casualties and all of that. And there was never the stomach to invade Cuba, at least from listening to those long hours of discussion. So I'm sorry I cannot help you on that.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for your lecture and for your answers. And thank you, everyone, for attending this event. Now we will conclude today's event, and good afternoon to everyone attending. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for having me.